Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the Illinois state budget, the state school choice scholarship program, and the status of ethics reforms. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. Some warn the budget Illinois state lawmakers approved in the early morning hours last Saturday will require supplemental appropriations in order to balance. Democrats passed the budget without Republican support. The $50.6 billion spending plan has a surplus of around $100 million. State Representative John Cabello warned of increased costs for a looming contract with public employees or subsidies for undocumented migrant health care.
We can continue to put our heads into the sand and pretend like this budget isn't a problem, or it isn't setting the table for a tax increase, possibly another huge tax increase.
Others warned the unknown costs would require a supplemental appropriation when lawmakers return for fall session. Last week, Governor J.B. Pritzker said, with powers the legislature's giving him in the plan, they don't expect to ask for more money.
There's no plan for a supplemental, but obviously things pop up potentially. But there's nothing that's been planned to be pushed to some future date.
Meanwhile, the Invest in Kids program, the closest thing Illinois has to school choice, may not be dead yet. Kevin Bessler explains.
The program, which grants tax credits to people who fund scholarships that allow students to attend private schools, is scheduled to sunset December 31st if legislative action isn't taken. Governor J.B. Pritzker says the program should be reworked so that the federal government picks up some of the tab.
Let's alleviate the burden on Illinois taxpayers and make sure that, frankly, as other states do, let's let other states pay in part for the benefit that we get.
Pritzker says lawmakers could approve an extension during a special session or during the fall veto session. State Representative Brad Halbrook says the families enrolled in the program need a long-term commitment.
I mean, if you've got a youngster that's, starting first grade or second grade, you're going to want to make different plans than just a one-year term, right?
Over 9,000 students in Illinois received the tax credit scholarship during the last school year. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Despite statehouse corruption on full display with guilty verdicts against 4 individuals in the ComEd 4 bribery trial, Illinois legislators left Springfield without sweeping ethics reforms. A former Commonwealth Edison executive and 3 lobbyists, one being a close confidant of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, were convicted last month. The scheme involved giving do-nothing jobs to Madigan associates in exchange for favorable legislation for the utility. Madigan has pleaded not guilty and faces trial next spring. Peoria Republican State Representative Ryan Spain said it's crazy to leave town without addressing the issue.
4 convictions, all swirling around the person that presided at this rostrum, at this dais, for 38 years, and we as a legislature are adjourning without doing anything on the topic of ethics reforms.
Governor J.B. Pritzker said prosecutors have the tools they need to catch corrupt actors.
Everybody that's been tried and now convicted is being tried and convicted on laws that are already on the books.
Lawmakers aren't scheduled to return until sometime this fall. Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find more online at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. Greg, how are you?
Well, it's not 2:30 in the morning where we're at right now. However, somebody could listen to this at 2:30 in the morning if they chose, but we're not up late passing budgets in the dark of night.
I was wondering where you were going with the 2:30 a.m. thing, Greg, but now I get it. Yes, the Illinois legislature finally passed a budget in overtime in the middle of the night, a budget that lawmakers didn't have really enough time to read. Certainly taxpayers like you and me and our listeners didn't have time to look into what's into it. But it is passed along party lines with Democrats in support, Republicans in opposition. Greg, tell us a little bit about the budget that was passed and what concerns Republicans have for it.
Well, legislators giving themselves another pay increase in the budget, and looks like taxpayers are going to be paying more in taxes and fees in the budget. And this all is going to spend $50.6 billion. That's billion with a B. And there's not much wiggle room when it comes to any unknown costs there are lying out into the future, such as the estimated $1.1 billion for subsidies going to undocumented migrant health care, or the looming contract with state employee unions. So really, it's a tight budget. The Democrats say it's balanced. Republicans say it's not balanced, and they're giving themselves a raise. While it's not necessarily spelled out in the budget because it's previous year tax reductions, you're going to see the grocery tax increase back to 1%, and you're also going to see another gas tax increase. And that's all part of stuff that had been passed previously. But we had a gas tax increase January 1st. We're going to have another one July 1st. So taxpayers are going to be paying more. Lawmakers expecting to get a raise in pay close to $90,000, making them among the highest paid state legislators in the country. All part of the largest state budget in state history. Increases spending for K through 12, increases spending for higher education, and a whole host of different spending in this budget that's funded by the tax dollars.
Well, Greg, I mean, there is so much to unpack here in the budget. In fact, we're still unpacking the budget at thecentersquare.com because of how late it was introduced, thousands of pages long, tons of new spending in there. We will be writing about this for weeks at thecentersquare.com, but I don't even know where to start here. But I will start with the legislative pay increase. Well, as you mentioned, it is a $50.6 billion spending plan, by far the largest in state history. Lawmakers raised their salaries again by almost $5,000 annually. They're at $89. They will be at $89,675 annual salary, and that doesn't include the perks, for example, for committee chairman and leadership positions, per diems for traveling to Springfield and whatnot. And correct me if I'm wrong, Illinois is still a part-time legislature, isn't that right?
Some lawmakers may push back on that, saying that they deal with constituent services all year round. But when you look at the legislative calendar, it's not a year-round job. They come in for 3 days out of a week during spring session, maybe 4 days out of a week. They'll cancel some days. But then you get into these stints at the tail end of session where it's 15, 16-hour days, if not longer. They're going into the early morning hours while taxpayers are asleep. So while some say that they treat it as a full-time job, there are some legislators like State Representative Dan Calkins or State Representative Marty McLaughlin who do not see it as a full-time job. They see it as a part-time job. And even Calkins saying that he returns his salary not to the state treasury. He says he doesn't trust the state treasury to take those dollars back and spend them appropriately. So he will actually go and donate it to other causes that he sees fit. So there's definitely a difference in philosophy amongst some lawmakers when it comes to whether or not it's a full-time or a part-time job. But on paper, Dan, they're not in all year. They're only in for a handful of weeks in the spring and then a handful of weeks in the fall.
Right. And this $50.6 billion spending plan. Democrats say that it's balanced and that it actually has a surplus of around $100 million. We're still looking into that and talking to budget experts about it. But what that doesn't take into account was April's revenue report, where we saw April revenue coming into the state, tax revenue coming into the state of Illinois was well over $1 billion less than it was in April 2022. That's just 1 month. But we'll be getting May's revenue report here in a couple of weeks, I would think. What if that trend continues? What if revenue continues to fall? You also have some of the unknowns in the expenses. There are estimates there about the Medicaid, the healthcare coverage for undocumented migrants. That's pretty much a guess, particularly with more and more migrants relocating to Chicago and the Chicago area and all parts of Illinois from the southern border. So those numbers are really unknown. I don't know. What are Republicans saying about the budget?
Yeah, they ultimately decried the process, quite frankly. It being last minute, while some Senate Republicans may have had a seat at the table earlier in the process, they weren't part of it at the tail end. And House Republicans say that they were completely frozen out of budget negotiations. And some of the other elements of the budget, of course, you had mentioned the undocumented migrant healthcare costs. Governor Pritzker says that part of this overall plan that has been approved, not yet signed by the governor as of Thursday afternoon when we're recording this. They have yet to send the budget to the governor's desk for a signature. The budget starts July 1st. But the governor has said that in the plan, it's giving him more ability to possibly control some of the costs of the undocumented migrant healthcare coverage. And that could be through things like copays. But there are other elements of the budget that the Republicans said gives the governor too much authority. For instance, there's a line in there about allowing the administration and executive agencies to transfer funds from one fund to the next. Typically, that's been allowed, but only by about 4%. This budget, for whatever reason, gives the governor the ability to do an 8% transfer among budget lines for executive agencies. Republicans saying that takes away the power of the legislature, that takes away the power of oversight, that takes away the role that the legislative body is meant to play. So they push back saying that transparency wasn't there. This gives the governor too much authority. It's not focused on the right priorities. The pay raise is bad. And even local government distributive funds. Yes, this increases for what local governments are going to get from state tax dollars, but it does not restore it back to the 10% as local governments had historically gotten whenever the state of Illinois brought on a state income tax. Brief history lesson. When we had the income tax implemented, the goal was, and the plan was, to not have local governments levy an income tax on top of the state income tax. So the state said, we're going to give you 10% local governments of every income tax dollar we bring in. Well, decades ago, that was cut. And recently, even I look back on some previous stories from like 2021, it was down to like 5.4%, not the 10%. Now, this budget does increase it from about 6.2% to 6.5%. But again, that's not the full 10% that local governments have been demanding. The Illinois Municipal League says they're happy they got an increase, and it is going to be a substantial increase. It's about $112 million across the state. But they said they still are pushing to get that full restoration to the 10% of the LGDF funding. But there's also something Republicans had pushed back on about personal property replacement taxes. Apparently, the budget also has a shift of about $700 million statewide going away from local governments in those tax receipts, which Republicans say when it comes out in the wash, local governments are actually doing worse in this budget. Democrats push back and say there's plenty of spending in this budget that's going around all across the state for infrastructure, for schools, for local governments. So it really is, I guess, some people see it a glass half full. Others see a glass that's half empty. But taxpayers are seeing the tax bill.
Well, we'll continue to cover the fallout of the budget at thecentersquare.com. Listeners can watch Greg's and Greg's team's reporting. Let's move on and talk about something that's not in the budget or that was not passed this legislative session. That has to do with the Invest in Kids scholarship program for school choice, where lower income families in public school districts that were maybe their local public school was not serving the needs of their students. Since Governor Rauner's administration, there has been this Invest in Kids program where individuals or companies can donate money to a scholarship program in exchange for a 75% tax credit. And that scholarship money can go to families who want to send their children to schools other than their local neighborhood public school. That is set to expire in December, and lawmakers did not address that.
Yeah, and this is going back to when this was first implemented. It was late in the Rauner administration, and it was part of an overall plan to change the school funding model for the schools the state's K through 12 schools. A lot of concern about proration, which essentially meant some school districts saw cuts in their spending while others didn't. So what the new updated school funding formula does is it lays out that each year until the schools get to full funding, there's going to be an increase of $350 million for K through 12 schools. But in order to get bipartisan support on that, back in, I believe it was 2017, the Rauner administration and Democrats who controlled the legislature, they agreed to a privately funded school choice scholarship program, and that's where the Invest in Kids program came out. And it's been operating. The most recent school year, there were 9,000 families whose children were the recipients of these grants. And these are families that are of a certain means. They're not wealthy by any stretch. But the grant program, Invest in Kids, has helped them take their kids out of a school they see as failing their students and putting them into private schools or gifted schools where they can actually excel. And the program's been very successful, Dan. I'm on the ground at the Capitol, and there are families that show up when they're in session wearing blue shirts saying, "Save my school," and they are adamantly and passionately in support of the Invest in Kids program. And these are families from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of ethnicities, all sorts of income levels, especially when it comes to being of lesser means. And they swear by the program that it's given their children a real shot at accelerating their education. But Democrats and Republicans apparently couldn't come to terms before they adjourned for spring session, so they're off for the summer. The big question is, what's going to happen? The uncertainty of the Invest in Kids program moving forward. If it expires December 31st, as the law is set out right now, without any changes, then that means, the new school year that starts up this fall, families may be able to get a crack at getting some of those grant dollars for their students to go to a private school. But at the same time, it might just only be for half the year if the Invest in Kids program is not re-upped or if the sunset is not lifted. So that leaves a lot of uncertainty for these families as to whether or not they're going to have their children in a school of their choice using the Invest in Kids scholarship for an entire year or just for half a year. Now, earlier this week, Dan, the governor was asked about the Invest in Kids program and what's going to happen with it. And he indicated that if the legislature passes a bill to extend the program, he will sign it. But then he also said that he does see the possibility of some changes, and he wants to see maybe the state income tax credit reduced substantially and push for the federal government to increase some kind of tax credits so that the state is not on the hook, as he sees it, for those tax credits. Just to note, the opposition to the Invest in Kids program seems to really be coming from the teachers' unions, and they have said for years that they feel that the tax credit diverts public dollars away from public schools, so they are opposed to it. But the program's success, I don't think, can be undermined, especially when you talk to the parents whose kids are benefiting from the program. So we'll see what happens. Of course, lawmakers are off this summer, but they have fall veto session where they could take this up and a whole host of other things. So we'll be watching that very closely and see what kinds of different ideas might pop up.
Of the more than 9,000 students final point on this one, because I want to cover one more topic, Greg. So let me just close with this. Of the more than 9,000 students who participated in the scholarship program this past school year, obviously many of them, are in elementary grades, might have been participating in the program for the past several years. Say you've been in the scholarship program for 3 or 4 years. If it ends December 31st, your student essentially has been going to the school of their choice, a private school or whatever. They're not going to be able to afford to go to that school anymore. So they're going to have to be removed from that school and go to the local public school, which may not be doing a great job educating students. That said, let's move on, Greg. Another thing that did not happen this past legislative session was sweeping ethics reforms, particularly in the aftermath of the ComEd 4 bribery trial, where a former lawmaker and high-ranking executives at ComEd and lobbyists were found guilty of essentially a bribery scheme attempting to influence longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan to get legislation through that was favorable to the utility. No ethics reform after the ComEd 4 guilty verdicts. Why not?
There was a bill dealing with red light cameras and some ethics provisions that were put into that bill. But that bill was a large bill that also said that if a red light camera or a speed camera is going to be posted somewhere, there must be a sign posted, and the vendor can't give the ticket. The governing body has to be the one to give the ticket, and a whole host of other provisions. But it had in there, tucked in there, that the red light camera industry can't give political donations to a local or a state elected official. And that's after several state lawmakers and even local officials, especially in the Chicago suburbs, were hit with bribery charges from federal prosecutors. So they addressed the red light camera ethics aspect of the ethics problems at the statehouse and elsewhere. When it comes to directly addressing what happened with the ComEd 4 and what we're going to see happen next spring with Mike Madigan, who's pleaded not guilty, but those associated with this case were found guilty just about a month ago, last month, up in a federal courthouse in Chicago. Lawmakers, from my understanding, had very little public discussion about what needs to change at the State House. Republicans have held news conferences, have conducted interviews, have talked with the media about this over and over again. Even on the House floor, right before they passed the budget, State Representative Ryan Spain, a Republican from Peoria, he made a point to say, while budgets are an indication of our priorities, he says that it's crazy, quote, crazy, that they would leave the Illinois State House for the summer without taking up any kinds of substantive ethics reforms to directly address what happened with the ComEd 4 trial. It's almost like the trial and the guilty verdicts didn't even happen. They didn't hold a subject matter hearing to unpack and read out the indictments and to go through the evidence and maybe look at, well, this evidence here shows that we could probably close a loophole there, or this evidence there shows that we could possibly, give the legislative inspector general more power to investigate over there. That was not done. Will it be done in the future? We may see something pop up over the summer, but even Governor Pritzker says when it comes to ethics reforms, those ComEd 4 that were found guilty, they were found guilty because of laws that are already on the books. And that seems to be a go-to comment from Democrats at the State House when people ask about where are the ethics reforms. So no sweeping ethics reforms past the State House before lawmakers adjourn for the summer. It's possible they could bring it back up in the fall veto session, and we'll be watching closely.
Never a shortage of things to talk about when it comes to Illinois state government, is there, Greg?
Absolutely not. It keeps me in my job, Dan.
That's both of us. There's plenty more to talk about here when it comes to this past legislative session, both the budget and other things that did get passed, things that didn't get passed. You can follow Greg and team's great reporting on this at thecentersquare.com. But we are now out of time. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening.